will now give us an outline of Todd's involvement in meteorology. Mac's a retired university lecturer and now volunteers for the Australian Meteorological Association, leading a volunteer project at the Weather Bureau in Kent Town. Excuse me. The mission of the project is to rescue lost historical weather data, and for the past 5 years, Mac and his team have been working with the meteorological journals of Charles Todd and his staff. He'll put the case that meteorology was as important a part of Todd's career activities as any other of his responsibilities. Mac.
I notice already that the technology has let us down. No, I'm not into barcodes up the top. That should actually read the Todd Symposium, so I don't know what's happening with translation. I stand here today as one of the later speakers, and I have to admit that when we sat down as a group of speakers about 3 months ago to plan the day, one of the things we had to plan was the sequence of speakers. And I'll admit that my nose was really quite radically out of joint to realize that I was coming near the end, because I thought Todd was important enough in meteorology that he should actually be somewhere near the beginning when we talk about meteorology. But as I reflected on Todd's work in meteorology, which was a 30-year endeavor, well, 50 years in total, but a 30-year endeavor in building our modern meteorological network, he called on all his other disciplines. So I make the plea that I'm actually badly placed. I should actually be the last speaker. But so hopefully today I can take you through that building of Todd the meteorologist from his very early days up until 1905, I think it was, when he retired. I don't claim to be a discipline expert, unlike most of the other speakers. I've arrived to meteorology very late, and I do apologize if I step on any toes for the professional meteorologists in the audience, but you can take that on me later. However, having worked with the Todd Folios, I've certainly gained an appreciation for the man, an appreciation for some of his early historical work in meteorology. I want to tackle Todd at several levels, but probably in terms of meteorology, to actually look at a timeline in terms of actually identifying when did this man start developing an interest in meteorology. And for this talk, I will be relying on some of the background work done by Dr. Tony Rogers, who also works with us as a volunteer project manager at the Bureau, and various other people who have published in the area on Todd. Tony has actually brought the fact to me that back in England, Todd's involvement with Greenwich, as we well know, was where he really started, or was one of the starting points for his professional career, which was a world center for a variety of discipline areas, but also principally was a world center for the development of the new discipline of meteorology. And there is no doubt that Todd not only was learning his telegraphic skills and his astronomy skills and so forth, but he was also learning skills in meteorology very early in his career while he was in England. Todd actually references a chap called James Glaisher, who was as a friend and a colleague, and James Glaisher is actually recognized basically as one of the foundation members of meteorology in England and indeed in Europe. And Glaisher was a junior assistant at Cambridge to 1835 before moving to the Greenwich Observatory. So 20 years before Todd actually left for Australia, for South Australia, he was actually, 20 years before Todd left, the person who he was dealing with before he left had actually had a 20-year background in meteorology. So he is steeped in meteorology, and Todd definitely was friendly and a professional colleague of this man. So meteorology was in Todd's bones before he even climbed on the ship to come out here. And indeed, we have further references to that in the fact that he was not only exposed to the concepts of meteorology, but exposed to the concepts of the importance of obviously timely collection of meteorological observations to allow you to create such things as synoptic charts and so forth, which are a foundation point for meteorological analysis. And that, of course, was done through the telegraph, and that he saw in England. Proof of Todd's early commitment to meteorology came in an article in the newspaper in Adelaide 1 year after he arrived here, and Todd was quoted as saying what is required is an extensive, cooperative and uniform system of observation with instruments compared with known standards. Those of Greenwich as the national standards being the proper ones, so that the results may be comparable with each other. The instruments I have brought. So when Todd climbed on board the ship, for his first journey to South Australia, not only did he bring telegraph wire, but he also brought undoubtedly astronomical instruments, and he also brought meteorological instruments with him. So if nothing else, we can see Todd as having at least 3 technical and scientific endeavors when he climbed on board that boat. So he brought with him, have all been most carefully compared to the Greenwich standards by my friend and the late colleague James Glacier. So he understood instrumentation right from the beginning as having to be standardized and to be normalized and compared with international standards in Greenwich. In his early colonial days, Todd started immediately establishing meteorological record. We don't have, at this stage anyway, Tony may be searching this down as he looks into Todd's early years over the next 12 to 24 months for the book that he'll be publishing. But the early meteorological records he started keeping at the Survey Office, and then of course moved these to the West Ayres Observatory in 1860. So as part of his general endeavors, meteorology was something he did on a daily basis. And indeed, again in that article in 1856, it's quoted that we have much pleasure in publishing today, this is the journalist, the first installment of a new series of meteorological observations by Mr. Charles Todd. Nothing of this kind has been published for many years, and the attempt to introduce a more comprehensive system of observation reflects great credit on Mr. Todd. So we're going back to 1855 in the very early days. Todd actually was the first to theorize that weather actually moves, as we all know now, because we see the animated weather systems on our television every night, that weather actually moved from west to east. Prior to that, it was thought that weather moved, in the general population, it was thought that weather moved from east to west. And again, Ernest Cook, who has been referenced before, who was Todd's assistant, actually was quoted at the International Geographic Conference in 1904, said that the belief was that since settlements started on the East Coast, weather was thought to follow and move later to the other colonies. And undoubtedly, I mean, New South Wales was more important than Victoria, and they were collectively obviously a lot more important than South Australia. I mean, WA was hanging off the end of the world anyway. So obviously weather went to the significant people first, and if anything, moved to the lesser significant. Now we can laugh at that, but you didn't know that this was happening until you actually put in a telegraphic network which allowed you to actually map these weather systems. Todd was theorizing this before the telegraph came in. So the great man was actually thinking globally about weather across the whole expanse of the Australian continent. Indications are also that Todd kept abreast of overseas developments, and again, at a conference he was indicating that back in the early days, in 1858, a date which closely coincides with that given by Professor Waldo as marking a definite epoch in the development of the modern science and technology. The investigation of the law of storms by Buys and Ballot, Dove and others, and the researches of Ferrel then just commenced on the theory of atmospheric motions, cleared the way for further advances, etc., and blather on. But Todd was deeply involved in the conceptual development of meteorology overseas during this whole period. Todd went through a period of capacity building, and this is where I think Todd probably excels and shows himself as a leader. It was a 30-year endeavor. The journals that we're working with just start showing the markings of what modern meteorology was looking like in 1879. Considering he started in 1855, we're looking at 20 to 25 years, and then round about the mid-80s, 1880s, we could say that we had an established network that was working. And there's no doubt that Todd was laying the blocks during that period. Quietly behind the scenes, we'll be looking for the documentation for that. There's no doubt that telegraph was an enabler, and we'll be seeing that a little bit later on in a slide coming up. But Todd was quoted as saying that the electric telegraph is to the meteorologist what the telescope is to the astronomer. And we'll see that in a few minutes. Todd, importantly, was not only the key to the overland telegraph, which we all understand, but was also important to connecting all the states, all the colonies together into the continental network of telegraphy. And it was through this network that he was able to collect the meteorological observations, map them, and start looking at weather systems as they moved across Australia. Todd also trained a network of observers, and this is again looking at the administrative capacity of this man, that he was able to train his telegraphers not only to do telegraphy, but they were also trained to work with meteorological instruments and to report. He did the same with his postmasters, and he even trained regional police to do the same. Victoria was the only other colony that was doing it at the time. Instrumentation was extraordinarily important, of course, because if you were collecting observations, they had to be based around a standard. And again, Todd's work in engineering and in astronomy gave him the feel for the importance of instrumentation and where that applied in meteorology. So I early established meteorological stations at Clare, Kapunda, Strathalbyn, Goulburn, Robe, Mount Gambier, placed rain gauges at the different telegraph offices. I also introduced a system of publishing daily reports of the weather and rainfall from all stations at the head telegraph office in Adelaide. We have now meteorological stations having standard or border trade barometers, dry and wet bulb thermometers, maximum minimum thermometers, rain gauges at Port Darwin, here we go, this is the Overland Telegraph, daily waters, Alice Springs, Charlotte Water, Strangways, and so forth. So Todd was building, now each one of these stations needed training, instrumentation, and follow-up, and Todd and his department were involved in that. Standardized time zones were important. If you're going to take observations, you have to make sure that they're collected at the right time. And of course, as has already been pointed out, the timing system prior to setting standard time zones was all over the place. Todd also worked at the meta level, I suppose, at the policy and practice level. As has been pointed out, he attended colonial conferences on astronomy, on the postal system, and definitely on meteorology. There were 3 major conferences, of which we have some of the proceedings. The one in 1879 actually established not just an Australian-wide network, but an Australian-New Zealand-wide network, and again, we'll see that in a couple of minutes. At Melbourne, they had a meeting in 1881 to actually adopt the new concept of isobaric mapping, and those are the maps we see on television with the weather fronts coming through. And in September 1888, there was an agreement that forecasts would be issued. By the way, one thing I love to throw out, and this is going to compromise my time, in Adelaide, when do you think the next first day temperature forecast was done? For the first time in history. Todd's forecasting was, tomorrow we'll have a change, rain will be coming in sometime in the middle of the day and so forth, and it'll be cloudy and cool. But any ideas? Anybody want to take a punt? Do you think it's about 1900, 1910, 1920, First World War, Second World War? 1961. So from 1888, Todd's first forecast, till 1961, the forecast you read in the paper didn't really change much in terms of substance until 1961, when we became brave enough to actually start forecasting the temperature. So Todd was doing that back in the 1880s. Meteorology, to me, is the pinnacle, and that's where I'm saying I should actually be coming at the end, because to build a meteorological network and to start looking at weather scientifically, the starting point is to actually map the weather as it has occurred in the very recent past, i.e., let's say 9 a.m. the day before. To do that, you need an extensive network of observers. You need accurate observations with instruments that have been standardized against each other and are constantly calibrated to make sure they're correct. You have to know the exact time of the observations as to when they're made. So if you ask for a 9 o'clock observation from Una Whoop Whoop up the Murray River, you have to make sure that they know exactly when 9 o'clock occurs. You have to be able to accurately place those observations on a map geographically. You have to know exactly where on the map they fit. And the observations have to be brought to central point in a timely fashion. It's no good having these observations made and then wait for the Pony Express to bring it into you 2 weeks later from Queensland. You need those observations now to be able to map what happened yesterday. Well, the extensive network of observers, one of the areas that he used, of course, was his control of the Postal Department to train his postal people to be observers. Accurate observations and instrumentation, his background in engineering gave him a thorough grounding in the importance of meteorological instruments and how they were calibrated and how you were able to work with them. His notion of exact time of observations, of course, astronomy comes into that. His accurate observations on the map, surveying was extraordinarily important for that. And observations to a central point, of course, telegraphy. So in essence, his meteorological endeavor was building on all the skills that he was building in his other discipline areas. Let's see how this comes together, just principally in this case with the Overland Telegraph. So if we look at a map, a weather map of 17th of March, 1884, I basically randomly picked this out, and this is the beginning of the period when Todd was actually able to construct continental weather maps. You'll notice the little red lines along the coast, and actually if you look, you can just see there is an 09, there is a 18, and so forth. These are the barometric readings. You place a line between these readings at a point that says the column inches of mercury, let's say 29.9 inches, 30.0, 30.1, 30.2, and you draw the lines. Well, with the intercolonial, certainly down the southeastern corner, you can actually start connecting those lines together and get the beginning of a barometric map. But you've got huge areas that just aren't reporting to you, and that you may have a line, a point here, that has a similar barometric reading to a point down here in South Australia, but you don't know whether those lines connect this way, or indeed that line goes off that way, and this line may connect this way. So what you desperately need, of course, is an overland telegraph, and not only operators of the overland telegraph, but people who can make readings along that line. And what happens then is if you have a similar reading in Queensland and it connects with a leading on a point on the overland telegraph and connects with South Australia, you can start making some pretty good guesses about where those lines go. So there's an example as you go through that you can connect those lines. You make a guess about how it curves, but if you include all the other lines, you start to develop a national network. Now, can you imagine in Victorian times to sit there and see this map, that weather isn't something that happens outside this window, and it's raining in Adelaide today. I have no idea what's happening in Melbourne. And why do I have any reason to believe the weather that's happening today here may be happening in Melbourne tomorrow, which is a 2-week boat journey for me, or maybe a 2-day train journey? To actually see this all of a sudden presented in front of you. To Victorians, this was an astonishing indication of a collapse of time and a collapse of distance. That what's happening in Adelaide is probably resulting from what happened in Western Australia yesterday and what may be happening in New South Wales tomorrow. You are all interconnected, and it's a continental activity that's going on here. And not only is it continental, while we've got the red box of crayons out, or box of red crayons, why don't we just reach across the Tasman and pick up the New Zealanders as well and construct ourselves a really large map, guessing what's actually happening in the Tasman. So there is a map of 1884. What I was challenged to think is, these things were being drawn on West Terrace at the observatory here in little old Adelaide, in Australia, in the middle of nowhere. The vast majority of people elsewhere in the world would know nothing about it. But surely this is a significant map as meteorology goes for the early 1880s. So I went to the NOAA in the United States and dragged up their map. And in the topic of, mine's really big, how big is yours? Well, there's my map. There's the American map of exactly the same day. Interestingly, of course, they're using a telegraph network. Notice down here through the Rockies, by the way, they're not connecting their lines. And there's no doubt that the Rockies presented a problem for the American forecasters because they didn't have any data coming through. They weren't as brave as Todd. Todd would have drawn dotted lines between those. Americans were a bit more purist, I suppose. But if you take that American map and actually collapse it, sorry, actually collapse it to be the American superimposed on Australia. I'm still connected. You actually end up with that kind of superimposition. Sorry? This one. Or the pointer. Okay, that's fine. You'll notice, of course, that Todd's maps still have a greater geographic extent than the Americans were doing. The only other weather group anywhere in the world who could be doing as well were the Europeans, and hunted as well as I could. I still couldn't find anything from England or from the rest of Europe, except reconstructed maps of the present day looking backwards, but actual maps from the day. The best I could come up with is a map produced out of England at the end of the First World War, so we're talking 30 years later. So even if you take this map from the north end of Norway down to Spain, turned it around and superimposed it on Australia, we still have a weather map smaller than the ones that Todd was drawing in 1883 on West Terrace. So just to give you the feeling that this man really was a pioneer and indeed was doing world historical work. Todd then developed a public face and started publishing these synoptic charts, published for daily consumption at the post office. In the exhibition outside, you can see some of his early maps. The idea that a lot of the early maps were based on arguments and discussion within the Weather Bureau, as it was at those days, about what a map should look like. But by the early 1880s, he realized, I want to publish this now for public consumption. And he put up the 6 maps, without Sunday, of each week. And as a new map came up, he'd take down the old one and put the new one up. And he was hoping the general public would understand the concept of weather moving through the continent as they look from map to map. He issued his first forecast on the 15th of November, 1883. This is literally 2 weeks after the decision was made at that intercolonial conference in Melbourne that we should be doing forecasting. I now want to talk briefly about the Todd weather folios, and again, you get some concept of them out there. And this is Todd's eye to posterity. Buried within the weather folios are over 11,000 pages of weather maps, clippings, annotations, letters from farmers about the weather and so forth. And that's what we, as a group of volunteers at the Weather Bureau, have been dedicating ourselves to doing, is capturing these as images and hopefully eventually making them available on the web. But this was an eye to posterity. There's no doubt that Todd actually was putting all this work, Todd and his staff, into creating these weather folios that look something like this. And each book is pretty demanding in terms of holding up. And there were 62 of them. And it took us 3 years to digitize the lot, to image the lot. They're daily weather maps for 11,300 days. We must be one of the few, we're certainly the only one in Australia that can give you this continuous run. And we're continuing beyond Todd now, and we're up to 1929, to give you a continuous run from 1st of January 1879 to the current day of synoptic charts as they existed in those days for the whole of the continent of Australia and quite often including New Zealand. They're rainfall maps, handwritten observations, news articles. I just estimate there are about 10 million words of news articles in there about the weather. What we have here is basically what's now termed old weather. And old weather is becoming very useful and interesting internationally, because if we're talking about climate change, Winston Churchill said, the further back you look, the further forward you can see. So if we want to look forward in the climate record, forward in what may be happening with climate change, the further backward you can benchmark, the further forward you're going to be able to see. And in the Todd folios, we have old weather data that doesn't exist anywhere else. So we're now digitizing it. Interestingly, Todd's work is now contributing to 21st century climate change analysis. Who would have guessed that this man and his department spent 30 years laboriously putting these together, that we'd have this happening? So just to take, for instance, one of the first pages out of his journals, 1879, you can see here, whoops, sorry. Yeah. You can see here the meteorological data that doesn't exist anywhere else. In the Met record internationally, we probably have 3 readings for barometric pressure. We can fill in up to 25. So that's what our volunteer group is doing. Indeed, we have now peeled off about 140,000 data points that don't exist, and we'll be sending those to the NOAA in the United States in Washington for the international data banks. That's coming straight from Todd. Sorry, I'm getting wrong. The weather maps later on got rather boring, but Todd was also then recording specifically pressure readings from New Zealand, Russell, and the Bluff and Wellington, even for Singapore, Batavia, and a number of other areas. We're also pulling that data off there. It doesn't exist anywhere else. So who was Charles Todd? And this is something I've wrestled with. He's definitely a man of extreme import, and I've been absolutely bowled over the interest in Todd when we decided to widen what was going to be a rather intimate briefing for the family at the fact that we had so many people who possessed this man. So I'd like to say that Todd did not excel so much as a research scientist, but as an exceptional technology entrepreneur and administrator. His capacity to implement science and technology in our young colony was due in large part to his legendary affability, reputation as a fix-it man, his seniority, and his obvious resolve to push through and fight the odds. By the way, do you realize Todd was a senior public servant for 53 years in a town that averaged about 80,000 people? Now, any of you who have worked in the public service at a senior level for 5 or 6 years, can you imagine doing it for 53 years? You would know every closet, every body, right? Every opportunity. And this man was able to marshal it and make things work on 6 discipline levels. But the key things here, I think, are affability and resolve. Those 2 statements, I argue, I'm now going to drag Todd into the 21st century as probably one of the best of the 21st century managers, because Jim Collins, an American business consultant, on company sustainability and growth has said that the term level 5 refers to the highest level in a hierarchy of executive capabilities we've identified in our research. Todd was a level 5. Just listen to this. As a level 5 leader is an individual who blends extreme personal humility with intense professional will. So there are two intentions there. A focus on where they want to go, but a focus away from the person and to the team. We found leaders of this type at the helm of every good to great company during the transition era. They were self-effacing individuals who displayed the fierce resolve to do whatever needed to be done to make the company great. Level 5 leaders channel their ego needs away from themselves and into the larger goal of building a great company. It's not that level 5 leaders have no ego or self-interest. Indeed, they're incredibly ambitious, but their ambition is first and foremost for the institution and not themselves. So finally, if nothing else, my message to you today is that it's outrageous to summarize this man's 50 years public service by his 2-year effort on the Overland Telegraph, heroic as it was. His contribution to meteorology was a 50-year endeavor, 30 years of which were spent building the capacity to run a national meteorological service in the emerging nation of Australia. This was only one of his legacies to our science and technology heritage. The full breadth and depth of this man's endeavors deserve our recognition today. And finally, I think at Federation we can say that Todd was Australia's senior meteorologist, and I'm sure I would probably get support from many of my professional colleagues here. He was also Australia's senior astronomer, senior postmaster, senior telecommunications specialist, and probably also the longest serving senior public servant on the continent of Australia. Thank you.